1,000 years ago in the Iberian Peninsula, no single faith ruled, no single language was spoken, and there was no single way of understanding the world. It was a land both divided and intertwined, a mosaic of cultures that shared far more than they were willing to admit. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side in cities like Toledo, Cordoba, and Zaragoza. And although their beliefs, customs, and languages were different, their lives intersected daily. In the streets, the markets, the schools, and even in the courts. This tense, often forced and occasionally fruitful coexistence was later dubbed, scornfully, by some chroniclers as the Spain of the Three Pigs. A provocative, insulting expression, not from a children's storybook, but born of the mutual contempt that often simmered beneath the surface. Each group viewed the others with suspicion, if not open hostility. To Christians, Jews were traitors to the gospel, and Muslims were heretical invaders. To Muslims, Christians were ignorant infidels, and Jews a protected but subordinate people. And to Jews, both Christians and Muslims were oppressive empires that tolerated them out of need, yet rejected them at heart. Still, from that tangle of distrust emerged something unique, a space of contact, friction, and exchange. Sometimes they cooperated. Sometimes they betrayed one another. Sometimes they shared books, science, medicine, poetry, or art. And other times, they persecuted each other with fanaticism. This strange coexistence gave rise to one of the most fascinating eras in Spain's history. Because the Iberian Peninsula wasn't just a battlefield between Moors and Christians, as the legends say. It was also a land where a Jewish scholar might translate Arabic texts into Hebrew and then into Latin, where a Muslim doctor might tend to a Christian king, and where a Christian poet might find inspiration in Andalusian rhythm and verse. This was the Spain of the Three Pigs, a Spain divided by faith, yet bound by a shared history, a Spain of constant tension, yet unmatched cultural richness, a Spain where differences were never erased, but could not be ignored either. And at the heart of it all was everyday life. The life of ordinary people, peasants, artisans, merchants, scholars, and soldiers. They, the anonymous ones, the ones left out of the history books, wove the invisible threads that held this impossible society together, however fragile those threads may have been. In this journey, I'll take you through that forgotten Spain. The Spain where Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted, clashed, and influenced one another. The Spain, where three worlds shared the same land and left behind a legacy that, although many have tried to erase, still lives on, in the stones of our cities, in the language we speak, in the music we hear, and in the history that continues to bind us. Because to understand who we are today, we must face who we once were. And that story, the story of the Three Pigs, isn't just an insult. It's the uncomfortable mirror of for centuries, Christians were the inhabitants of the mountainous north of the Iberian Peninsula. Resilient, isolated, proud. After the swift Muslim conquest in the 8th century, which swept through almost all of Visigothic Hispania, a handful of nobles, clerics, and peasants fled to the Asturian mountains. There, in the mist and the cold, a legend was born. The tale of a tenacious resistance that would slowly evolve into a reconquest. Oh, but be careful. History wasn't as clear-cut as we've been told. There wasn't a unified crusade or a holy war from the very beginning. On the contrary, for centuries, the Christian kingdom spent as much time fighting each other as they did battling the Muslims to the south. Yet even in the chaos, something new began to form. A Hispanic Christian identity rooted in Visigothic, Germanic, and Latin traditions, and shaped by constant contact with Al-Andalus. From the 9th to the 12th centuries, several Christian kingdoms were born and began to grow. Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, Catalonia, each with his own language, laws, and systems of government. Their cities were small compared to the great Muslim metropolises of the south, but within their monasteries and cathedrals, something decisive was taking root: written knowledge. While the Muslim world shone in philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics, the Christians were carefully preserving Latin and copying ancient texts by hand in dark scriptoria. Faith permeated every aspect of life. The church dominated spiritual, social, and political life. Bishops were feudal lords and monasteries centers of power. But medieval religiosity was not just about prayer and penance. It was also about festivity, community, fear of sin, and hope for salvation. Romanesque churches spoke to the illiterate through sculptures depicting the apocalypse and the lives of saints. The peasant lived with his eyes fixed on the cross, but also on the storms, the harvest, and the daily bread. Over time, the Christians of the north began expanding southward, conquering towns, cities, and lands from the Muslims. The Reconquista wasn't a straight line. It was a long series of wars, alliances, betrayals, and marriages. Sometimes Christians allied with Muslims against other Christians. Sometimes they tolerated Jewish communities within their walls in exchange for taxes and knowledge. Because in truth, what mattered most to many kings wasn't religion, it was power, land, authority, and in that pursuit, they shaped a deeply unequal society where the Christian peasant owed obedience to the noble and the noble to the king, and above all of them, God. But not everything was war and nobility. The Christian cities of the north began to flourish: Burgos, León, Santiago, Barcelona. Each became a hub of trade, craftsmanship, and urban life. In their plazas, Latin dialects echoed, the songs of knights were sung, and a new language began to take shape: Castilian, a language slowly emerging as the common tongue of a new Spain. Meanwhile, on their city walls, Christians painted monsters and demons, perhaps reflections of the others who lived beyond the mountains or behind the walls, the Jews and Muslims who still shared their world, though now viewed with growing suspicion. Because if one thing defined medieval Christians, it was certainty. Their truth was the only truth, their God, the one true God. And their mission was to restore the peninsula to its former Visigothic glory. Such was life for the Christians in the Spain of the Three Pigs, fighting the south, but also fighting among themselves, searching for a glorious destiny while bearing the weight of a complex past. Between the sword and the cross, they laid the foundations of a world still far from unity, but one that would soon seek to impose it. They lived behind walls, but they weren't prisoners. They walked among Christians and Muslims, but they were neither. They were Jews, and for centuries, they were an essential minority in medieval Spain. Invisible to some, indispensable to others, and hated by many. In the land of the Three Pigs, they were always the uncomfortable third. The Jewish presence in the Iberian Peninsula goes back thousands of years. As early as Roman times, Jewish communities existed in cities like Tarraco, Cordoba, and Merida. With the arrival of the Visigoths, they endured persecution and forced conversions, but they also found ways to survive. And when the Muslims conquered Hispania in the 8th century, the Jews not only found a truce, but also an opportunity. During the early centuries of Al-Andalus, the Jews experienced a golden age. They studied astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. They wrote poetry in Hebrew, translated classical texts, and served as advisors to caliphs and kings. In cities like Cordoba and Granada, figures like Hasdai ibn Shaprut, Samuel Hanagid, and Maimonides rose to prominence. Wise men who spoke Arabic better than Hebrew, who knew both the Talmud and Aristotle, and who acted as bridges between clashing worlds. But this tolerance was neither complete nor permanent. Jews paid special taxes. They couldn't carry weapons or ride horses. They had to dress differently. And their status, though protected under Islamic law as people of the book, was always at the mercy of the ruler in power. A revolt, a war, or a crisis was enough to make tolerance vanish like sand slipping through your fingers. When the Christian kingdoms began pushing south, many Jews remained in the reconquered territories. Some fled. Others negotiated their place. And not a few prospered under the new order. Because Christian kings weren't foolish, they knew Jews were essential for collecting taxes, keeping accounts, translating texts, and running cities. And so, they protected them as long as they were useful. Jewish quarters, called aljamas, with their own autonomy, spread throughout the peninsula, in Toledo, Seville, Zaragoza, Barcelona, and beyond. There, Jews lived by their own laws, with synagogues, schools, and rabbis. They observed Shabbat, Passover, Yom Kippur, and they coexisted with the rest at a cautious distance. The medieval Jew had to walk a careful line, not too rich, not too visible, not too wise, not too powerful, because to stand out was to become a target. And still, they were frequent targets. When dark times came, plagues, wars, famines, people looked for someone to blame, and the finger almost always pointed at them. They were accused of poisoning wells, of desecrating communion wafers, of sacrificing Christian children. These were lies, but lies that killed. Pogroms like the one in 1391, when thousands of Jews were massacred across Castile and Aragon, left deep scars. Many converted to Christianity to survive. Others fled. Those who stayed lived in fear. And yet, they remained, creating, thinking, teaching. Their influence was deep, though often hidden, in medicine, finance, philosophy, and mysticism. The Castilian language absorbed words from Hebrew, Ladino, and their way of life. Because the Jew was not just a moneylender or a doctor. He was also a father, a poet, a merchant, a neighbor. And for centuries, they were an inseparable part of Spain's soul. But they knew they would not be welcome forever. They were guests in a house that never truly saw them as family. A people caught between two fires, rejected by Muslims and Christians alike, feared by some, used by others, close to power, but never under its full protection. That's how the Jews lived in the Spain of the Three Pigs. As survivors of a story they didn't write, but helped to build. As heirs to an ancient faith, and as victims of a world that couldn't accept difference. A world that sooner or later would shut the door on them forever. For centuries, they were the undisputed masters of the South. They built palaces, mosques, gardens, and libraries. They tamed rivers, irrigated fields, and filled cities with light, cities that seemed to belong to another world. Cordoba, Seville, Granada. These were more than cities, they were symbols. This was Al-Andalus, the western jewel of Islam. And those who lived there, Arabs, Berbers, Muladis, were the Muslims of the peninsula. They came as conquerors and ended as the conquered. It all began in the year 711 when a Muslim army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and defeated the last Visigothic king. Within a few years, most of Hispania was under Islamic control. But it wasn't just a military conquest. It was the beginning of a new civilization. The Muslims didn't force conversion by the sword. They allowed Christians and Jews to keep their faiths in exchange for taxes. And little by little, many Hispano-Romans began to embrace Islam. Some out of faith, others for convenience. Still others simply because Arabic and Muslim culture became the language of power. Al-Andalus became a beacon. Cordoba rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople. Its streets echoed with at least 3 languages: Arabic, Hebrew, and Andalusian Romance. There were doctors who could operate on cataracts, astronomers who measured the movement of the planets, philosophers who debated Aristotle, and theologians who pondered the soul. In the madrasas, students memorized the Quran, but also studied geometry, logic, and poetry. It was a world where faith blended with science and beauty with discipline. But beneath the splendor, cracks began to show. Tensions between Arabs and Berbers, between new and old Muslims, between the devout and the lax, slowly weakened central power. The Caliphate of Cordoba dissolved in the 11th century, giving way to the Taifas, small independent kingdoms constantly at war with one another. That was when the northern Christians seized their chance, and what had seemed unthinkable for centuries began to unfold: the loss of the Muslim South. To resist, some Taifas called for help from African powers. First, the Almoravids, then the Almohads, fanatical warriors who brought with them a far more rigid and austere Islam, one that even clashed with the Andalusians themselves. Even so, they managed to halt the Christian advance for a time. But the South was no longer what it had been. The great cities still lived, but their power was fading. Culture continued to flourish, but fear grew. Each defeat, each lost city was an open wound. Amid this decline, a final bastion was born, the Kingdom of Granada. Small, mountainous, yet dazzling. The Nasrids ruled it for over 2 centuries, paying tribute to Castile to survive. It was there that the Alhambra was built, perhaps the greatest symbol of Andalusi art. A palace of water, marble, and silence. A swan song for a civilization that already knew its end was near. Meanwhile, the Muslims who lived under Christian rule, the Mudajars, tried to reserve their faith, their language, their customs, under constant suspicion. They were tolerated, but watched. And their presence, still numerous, became a source of tension. Because in the eyes of many Christians, the Muslims were the enemy within, the irreconcilable other, the pig who wouldn't eat pork. That's how Muslims lived in the Spain of the 3 pigs, as founders of cities, scholars of libraries, masters of plaster and tile, but also as exiles in their own land, as heirs to a brilliant civilization, yet condemned by history. They were once an empire, and then subjects, once feared, and then despised. And when the last stronghold fell, when Granada surrendered in 1492, their long disappearance began. But Al-Andalus was not erased. It remained in the words, in the tiles, in the music, and the legends. Because even when power shifts, the stones still speak. And those stones remind us that this land was once theirs too. For nearly 800 years, Christians, Jews, and Muslims shared the Iberian Peninsula. It wasn't an idyllic coexistence, nor an endless war. It was a complex, shifting, and ambiguous reality. There were times of tolerance and times of persecution, moments of collaboration and others of brutal hatred. But if anything defines that Spain, it's that for centuries it was a land of frontiers, not just physical ones, but also cultural, linguistic, and spiritual. The three peoples looked at each other with suspicion. Each believed it held the truth. Each thought the others were inferior, heretical, or dangerous. And yet, they needed each other. The Christian needed the Jewish doctor, the Muslim architect, the Hebrew moneylender, the Arab translator. The Jew needed protection, stability, the chance to live his faith without fear. And the Muslim, once he lost power, had to adapt, survive, negotiate. It was a coexistence born of necessity, not mutual love. And yet, it worked, for a time. Medieval cities were the clearest example of that unstable balance. One street separated the Christian quarter from the Jewish one. A wall kept the Muslim quarter apart. But in markets, on roads, in the courts, the three worlds met. There were loans, contracts, translations, alliances, and also insults, mockery, and prejudice. Each community lived by its own rules, but under the authority of a king or emir, who often played one against the other. Because for those in power, division was useful. As long as the pigs didn't unite, the farmer ruled. But history marched on, and the rope began to tighten. By the 15th century, the peninsula was no longer a shared land. It had become an ideological battleground. Christianity was triumphant. Castile and Aragon had united their crowns. The church demanded uniformity, and the Catholic monarchs wanted one faith, one language, one people. In 1492, the same year Columbus set sail for the New World, Granada fell, and with it, the last Muslim stronghold. That same year, all Jews were expelled from the Christian kingdoms. Convert or leave. The Muslims who stayed behind, the Mudéjars, were soon forced to convert as well. Thus were born the Moriscos, outwardly Christian, but forever suspect. In the 17th century, they too would be expelled. And so, what had once been a diverse land became a mono-religious society, uniform and impoverished in spirit. And what remained? Much more than it seems. Spanish kept hundreds of words of Arabic and Hebrew origin. Mudéjar architecture remained. Andalusi melodies echoed in flamenco songs. Sephardic tales, shared legends, and common superstitions endured. Because while the body was expelled, the imprint couldn't be fully erased. Today, when we look back and speak of the Spain of the Three Pigs, we risk falling into two traps. One is the romantic myth of ideal coexistence, as if Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in harmony. The other is the myth of eternal conflict, as if they only hated and killed one another. The truth lies in between. It was a story of constant contact, at times fertile, at times violent. But a story nonetheless. And like all stories, it speaks to what we were and what we might become. Because, at its heart, this is a story about identity. What is Spain? A Catholic nation? A mix of peoples? A crossroads of civilizations? The answer, perhaps, lies in accepting that it was all those things at once, and that only by understanding the plural past can we begin to understand who we are today. The Spain of the Three Pigs was many things: splendor and tragedy, faith and betrayal, wisdom and persecution. But above all, it was a mirror, one we can still look into if we dare.